In 1101 AD, a government clerk in Kaifeng sat down with a brush and red ink. His job was not to grade an exam. His job was to copy it. Word for word, character for character, every answer rewritten in his hand, so that the examiner would never know whose words he was reading. China invented blind review 900 years before Silicon Valley called it bias reduction. But here is the thing. This clerk, this system, this red ink, was not the beginning of the story. It was the patch. Someone had already found a way around the previous version, and the version before that, and the version before that. What you are looking at is not a tradition. It is an arms race between power and the system designed to contain it, and it has been running for 1300 years. Today, we decode why. Here is the argument. Keju, China's imperial examination system, was not an exam. It was an operating system. Specifically, a protocol engineered to solve one of the hardest problems any civilization has ever faced. How do you run a state of hundreds of millions of people without letting birth determine who holds power? Not as a philosophical ideal, as a technical constraint. The answer China arrived at, not in theory, but in code, in institutions, in specific bureaucratic innovations built and rebuilt across centuries, was this: remove identity from the equation entirely. Evaluate the output, not the origin. By the end of this video, you will never look at China's education system the same way again. Not because it is perfect, it is not, and I will not pretend otherwise, but because you will understand what it was actually optimizing for, and why that optimization target was one of the most radical ideas any civilization has ever installed at scale. To understand what the examination system was built to replace, you need to understand what came before it. Before Keju, China selected its officials through a system called Chaju, the recommendation system. Here is how it worked. Regional governors nominated candidates. Those candidates were evaluated by the people who nominated them. And those people, the governors, the aristocrats, the established clans, had every incentive to nominate people who looked like themselves. The result was captured in a phrase from the 3rd century.
上品无寒门，下品无士族.
In the upper ranks, no one from a poor family. In the lower ranks, no one from an aristocratic one. This was not a complaint. It was not a reformer's slogan. It was a description, a precise, accurate description of how the system ran. Birth determined rank, not as a cultural preference, as a structural output. And here is the tension this created. A civilization running on a bureaucratic operating system, one that required literate, capable administrators to govern vast territories, was systematically filtering out capability in favor of lineage. That is a bug, a serious one. So, in 605 AD, the Emperor Yang of Sui, Sui Yangdi, installed the first version of a new protocol. The first technical innovation was called
怀牒自尽.
Carry your own documents. Present yourself. 4 words that ended a system. Under the old code, you could not enter the selection process without a recommendation. Someone with power had to vouch for you. That single requirement, that one line of code, was the entire mechanism of aristocratic reproduction. Kuai Diezi Jin deleted it. For the first time in Chinese history, a man could walk to the examination hall, register himself, and compete on the basis of what he knew. Not who his father was, not who vouched for him, what he knew. But the first version of this system had vulnerabilities. In the Tang Dynasty, the 7th through 10th centuries, a practice called Xingjuan persisted. Candidates would submit their literary work to examiners before the test. Reputation, connections, family name, they still leaked through the cracks. The system was running the right protocol, but it had not yet closed the loop. That closure came in the Song dynasty, and it came through 3 specific patches, each one targeting a different attack vector on the integrity of the system. Hu Ming-fa came first. Seal the name. After submission, every candidate's name and place of origin was physically covered, hidden from the examiner's view. But the examiners still had one weapon left: handwriting. A man who had read your essays for years would know your brushstroke, the curve of your characters, the pressure of your hand on the page. So they closed that too. Teng Lu Jie. Every answer paper was recopied by a government scribe in red ink before it reached the examiner's desk. Your words, a stranger's hand. And then, the one that tells you everything about how seriously they took this, Suo Yuan Jie. Once appointed, the examiner walked into the examination compound and did not come out until the process was over. 3 locks. But notice what this sequence tells you. Each lock exists because someone found a way around the previous one. This was not a system designed in a single moment of enlightenment. It was a system that was stress-tested, attacked, exploited, and hardened across generations. That is not philosophy, that is engineering. And the data that followed was extraordinary. In the Tang dynasty, before these upgrades, candidates from non-elite families represented roughly 15.9% of successful graduates. By the Song dynasty, after the 3 locks were installed, that number reached 55.12%. More than half of China's highest officials now came from families with no hereditary claim to power. This was not a change in values, not a shift in cultural attitudes. This was an operating system executing its optimization target. And this is where it gets interesting. Here is the deeper pattern. Every large civilization eventually faces the same structural problem. How do you staff a complex administrative system without that system being captured by the people who already have power? This is not a Chinese problem, it is a universal one. European feudalism resolved this tension by making hereditary capture legitimate, encoding it into law, into title, into the divine right of bloodlines. The system did not fight aristocracy, it institutionalized it. China's code arrived at something structurally different. Not the elimination of hierarchy. China never optimized for that, but the decoupling of hierarchy from birth. The examination system said, you may rise, but you must prove the capacity to rise. And the proof must be submitted anonymously, recopied by a stranger, and evaluated by someone who has been locked in a room away from your family's reach. That is a specific architecture, with specific trade-offs. Here is the trade-off that most analysis misses entirely. When you destroy hereditary aristocracy through meritocratic examination, you do not create freedom. You create a different kind of pressure, because now the path is open, theoretically, to anyone. And when the path is theoretically open to anyone, the failure to walk it becomes personal. Under aristocracy, if you are born poor, the system has failed you. The injustice is external. You can point at the lord, at the bloodline, at the structure. Under meritocracy, if you fail the exam, the system has not failed you. You have failed the system. This is not a small psychological difference. It is a complete reallocation of where failure lives. And China's examination system ran this reallocation at scale across hundreds of millions of people for over 1,000 years. Extraordinary social mobility by pre-modern standards. Extraordinary psychological pressure as its permanent operating condition. Both of these things are true. Neither cancels the other. Now, here is the civilizational logic that matters most. Why did China need this system so urgently? Why was the pressure to install it and keep upgrading it so persistent across dynasties that disagreed on almost everything else? The answer is scale. At its Song dynasty peak, China governed a population of roughly 100 million people. The Roman Empire at its height governed approximately 50 to 60 million. The administrative challenge China faced was not comparable to anything Europe encountered until the industrial age. To govern that scale, you need a bureaucracy that can actually read, and one that answers to the center, not to the clan that hired it. And to build that bureaucracy without it being captured by regional warlords, hereditary clans, or local power networks, you need a selection mechanism those networks cannot corrupt. The examination system was not China's answer to the question, how do we find talented people? It was China's answer to a harder question, how do we stop power from becoming hereditary in the first place? Those are not the same question. They do not have the same answer. While Western civilization built individual rights as the primary firewall against the abuse of power, China's code arrived at institutional design as the primary firewall. Not protect the individual from the state, but design the state so that no individual and no family can permanently capture it. One civilization asked how to protect people from power. China asked how to stop power from calcifying. Both questions are legitimate, both produced coherent answers, and the world is still running both operating systems simultaneously right now. Every June, across China, 12 million students sit the Gaokao, the National College Entrance Examination. Western media covers it as a story about pressure, tiger parents, a system that sacrifices childhood on the altar of academic performance. And the pressure is real. I am not dismissing it. But here is what that framing cannot reach. The Gaokao is not a modern invention that happens to be stressful. It is the current runtime of a protocol first installed in 605 AD. The anonymized paper, the standardized question, the single score that crosses regional boundaries, family connections, and local power networks. When a student from a rural village in Gansu province scores higher than a student from a wealthy family in Shanghai, the system does what it was designed to do. It executes the original optimization target, ability over origin. Not perfectly. The system has its own inequalities. Urban schools are better resourced, preparation materials are unevenly distributed, regional quotas create their own distortions. These are real bugs. They deserve scrutiny. But the architecture underneath those bugs is not arbitrary. It is not the result of a government that wants to stress its citizens. It is the latest version of a 1,300-year-old answer to a 1,300-year-old problem. And now, look further. The logic of the examination system is not staying inside China's borders. Algorithmic hiring, blind resume review, standardized coding assessments that strip out names, schools, and pedigree before evaluation. The West is currently installing, piece by piece, under the banner of diversity and anti-bias technology, the functional equivalent of Hu Ming Fa. The anonymization law. Song Dynasty, 11th century. They are not copying China. They are arriving, independently, at the same technical solution to the same structural problem. Because the problem was never uniquely Chinese. The problem is universal. How do you evaluate capability without being corrupted by identity? China ran that code for a millennium. The West is in the early installation phase. And the question worth sitting with is not, why is China so obsessed with exams? The real question is, why did it take everyone else this long to ask the same question? Now you might be thinking, this is all very elegant as a systems argument. But what about the human cost? Consider Fan Jin, a character from the 18th century satirical novel Rulin Weishi. He is fictional the way all great satire is fictional. He describes something real. Fan Jin passed the provincial examination at 54 years old. 54. He had been sitting that exam since he was a young man, decade after decade, failure after failure. His entire sense of who he was, his worth, his standing, his place in the world, compressed into a single recurring moment. When the result finally came, he laughed, and then he couldn't stop laughing. The novel plays it as dark comedy. I've never been sure what to do with that. We call it madness. The system logged it as an edge case. Both descriptions are accurate. Neither one is enough. The examination system did not just create social mobility, it created a civilization where the path to dignity was singular. One road, one gate, one moment that could redeem or erase decades of a life. The psychological damage of that design is real, documented, not a Western misreading. But here is what that argument misses. The system the examination replaced did not distribute psychological burden more humanely. It made the burden invisible. Under aristocracy, you did not suffer the anxiety of potential failure. You suffered the certainty of permanent exclusion. You never had the chance to go mad from passing because you were never allowed to sit in the room. The examination system's bug, crushing pressure on those inside, was the direct consequence of its feature, opening the door to those who had always been locked outside. That is not a justification. That is a trade-off. And understanding the difference between those two things is the entire point of this channel. So the real question isn't whether the examination system was fair. Every operating system has bugs. Fairness is a parameter no civilization has ever fully optimized. The real question is this: a civilization looked at the problem of power, how it concentrates, how it reproduces itself, how it resists correction, and decided that the most durable solution was not revolution, not rights, not the dismantling of hierarchy. It was design. Institutional design so precise that it could strip identity from the equation at the moment of evaluation. And it ran that design, upgrading it, stress testing it, patching its vulnerabilities for 1,300 years. We are now building AI systems that are supposed to do the same thing: evaluate without bias, score without knowing the name, allocate opportunity based on demonstrated capability rather than inherited position. We are calling it innovation. China called it the 11th century. I don't know what to do with that gap. But I think it matters, more than most people building these systems have stopped to consider. That is a conversation for another time. If the examination system as an operating system changed how you understand China's relationship with meritocracy, the next piece of that puzzle is, why could ancient Chinese farmers do math? Link in the description.